Well, it's February 2019 and I'm here with past Commodore Kerry Roxburgh. Kerry, you're a long-standing member of the Cruising Yacht Club. You joined in 1971, but you were born in Albury, a long way from the sea.
I was, Peter.
How did you get to the CYC?
Well, it's a family story. My mother and father used to take me to Merimbula for Christmas holidays. And as a 4-year-old and many years subsequent to that, my dad would take me on the day after Boxing Day to Middle Beach in Merimbula, and we'd have binoculars and we'd look out to sea. And he'd say, those yachts have left Sydney and they're sailing to Hobart. And we'd look at the yachts and there was Winston Churchill and Astor and some of those famous old boats. And as a 4-year-old, I resolved that I would sail in Sydney-Hobart yacht race, and I did it.
Fantastic. So how and when did you come to Sydney?
I came to Sydney in 1969. I'd been to school in Melbourne and university and started work in Melbourne. And I was sent here for 4 weeks to do the audit of the Darrell Lea Chocolate Company, and I never went back.
Well, the chocolates were good, were they?
Chocolates were great.
Well, you as I said earlier, you joined the club in 1971. And
correct.
Did you know many people here at that stage?
Yes, Pat Corrigan, Kevin Weldon, David Mutton. They were friends of mine, and they introduced me to the club. I lived close by, and I started sailing with Corrigan, and fairly soon after joined the Cruising Yacht Club.
And what were your early memories of the club and some of the characters that were around at that time?
Well, of course, Mickleborough was there.
Excuse me for interrupting. Every interview we do and we ask
yes.
about the characters, he's number one pick on everyone's list. Bless him. The late Don Mickleborough, yeah.
David Mutton, the late David Mutton, was a character and always enjoyed.
Former treasurer, I think, wasn't he here at the club? Or
he might have been.
Yeah.
He was on the board. Always enjoyed a blunderbuss. Lou Dalpuget, he was the yachting writer for the Daily Telegraph. He was here. Of course, Peter Kurtz, and my great friend David Mayo. Yes. He was evident around the club as well.
And I think Vince Walsh was mixed up in all
Vince
that
was here. Vince was there, part of the Vaucluse mob.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah. Well, it didn't take you long to get involved with the club on the director side of things. I think records state that you became treasurer, I think, in 74. Would that be right?
That'd be right. Yeah. I did my first Hobart race, I think, in 72 on Alcheringa.
Right.
With Jim Bridgeland.
Was he Commodore then?
He was Commodore then, yeah. And I remember he helmed the boat, always had a pipe in his mouth upside down.
Right. So it didn't get water in it.
That's right.
But he's got a bit of an infamous story with this club. He was Commodore, and then he got disqualified out of the Sydney-Hobart race because he went to Hobart with, I think, 11-man crew with a 10-man life raft. Was that year or not?
Not that year,
Not that year, but he did one
no.
year as I don't know whether he was the serving Commodore or he was the past Commodore, but he did get disqualified. No. Imagine doing that today.
Well,
you get more than disqualified. Yeah.
Although we've seen a bit of that in the last Sydney-Hobart race, when I recall there was a politician who jumped overboard at Bondi, and so they didn't finish with
that's right. Crew they started.
With the crew they started with.
But back to Alcheringa, she was a sister ship to a raised deck sister ship to Bacchus D.
Correct.
On Payne design.
Correct.
She probably she probably needed about 25 knots to make it go, didn't she?
She was a bit of a clunker.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
But people got out of our way.
Yes. So you moved into as treasurer, and then they were interesting times. I think formative years for the club in the mid-70s, weren't they? A lot was happening.
Well, not only formative years, but it was a time when the club was in some financial difficulty. There was a question whether the club could survive financially. At that time, Joe Diamond, I think, had become Commodore. I did a bit of sailing with Tony Pearson, who also became Commodore. And I guess as an accountant, they asked me to join the board as treasurer. And we were the first board to offer a sponsorship of the Sydney-Hobart yacht race. It was $10,000 from TAA. First sponsorship, and we got into a lot of hot water from the members. But I'd suggest to you that that's the reason that this club stands out from all other yacht clubs in Australia, financially secure. And it was a decision that we made in the mid-70s.
Just looking back at the history and the book from David Coldfeld on the history of the club, he commends you and your financial committee, I guess, on putting the club in a very strong financial position in the mid-70s to late 70s. So that's a fine record to have. And then I think you're on the flag officers for 5 years, then you became Rear Commodore in 1977.
Correct.
And then Vice Commodore in 78 and 79.
That's right.
And then Commodore from 80 to 82. So,
something like that,
yeah,
Peter.
So it's a fine record and a great service you've done to the club. But during those times, I guess, Kerry, there were some strong people in the club. I mentioned specifically Gordon Marshall and Keith Storey,
Yes.
who did so much to make this club strong on a sailing front, from a safety point of view, a measurement point of view, and a Sydney-Hobart point of view. Just talk about those two guys specifically. Gordon first, Gordon Marshall.
Well, Gordon Marshall was a wonderful member of the club. Was on the sailing committee, and he was an engineer by training, and was always across the rules relating to boat design and eligibility for the Sydney-Hobart yacht race. I do, and for our other blue water races, I do remember when Prospector Ponsonby came across from New Zealand with Bruce Farr. It was the first time he'd entered a boat in the Sydney-Hobart yacht race, and there was great angst about the light construction of that boat. It did very well in that race, but the club committee, led by Gordon, spent a lot of time considering whether the entry should be accepted. I'm very pleased it was, because it was the beginning of the lightweight sailboats that didn't really sail through the water. They sailed across the surface of the water, and there was less pressure on the rigging and the hull and on the crew with that lightweight design, and I attribute that to the wonderful innovation of the New Zealanders. And I still say today that New Zealanders are amongst the best sailors and the best yacht designers in the world, and they hold the America's Cup as we speak. So I have great respect for the New Zealanders and their talent.
And Keith Storey, I mean, he was a backroom man, really.
He was.
Pop up much, but I mean, he did a lot of work behind the scenes, and especially as race director from a lot of years for the Sydney-Hobart race, wasn't he? Yeah.
Yes, he ran all of the communication and the safety for the race. He ran the radio centre in the club here whilst the race was in progress. Was here 24/7 for the duration of the race, and of course in those days the race, the last yachts would finish well after New Year's Day. And Keith stayed right till the end. He organised and staffed the radio centre here. Wonderful man.
Yes, no, and both Keith and Gordon were deservedly given life membership for the club.
Indeed they were.
Yeah. And during that time, I think Hitachi became the major sponsor, the first real major sponsor of the Sydney-Hobart race.
Yes.
Ken Caldecott from Victoria, yachtsman down there, he headed Hitachi up.
Indeed.
And I think the club liaison officer for Hitachi was the infamous Campbell's Tiger Scott. That'd be right, wouldn't it?
Well, your memory's very good, Peter. Yes, Ken Caldecott, he was very keen on sailing, was a wonderful supporter of the club, through his role at Hitachi, they took over the sponsorship. I think it was after TAA. I think they were the second sponsor, and they remained.
I think TA remained a sub-sponsor, didn't they?
They did.
They did, yeah.
Yes. But Hitachi, if you like, upped the ante, and you referred to the financial condition of the club improving into the 80s, and much of that was attributable to the generosity of Hitachi and the support for the club.
Yeah.
And Ken Caldecott enjoyed his time at the club as well as being the sponsor.
Yeah, and I think they were the first. They had the first naming rights of the race, didn't they?
They did.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hitachi Sydney-Hobart.
Yeah. Again,
racing.
there was great angst over that, and I can remember. I suppose it's a bit like amateurism in cricket and in tennis, but I remember the Suttons had a boat. I think it was a one-tonner called the General. And of course they were General Motors
Yes.
car dealers, and there was great angst in the club about whether the General should be allowed to sail with that name, again led by Tiger Scott,
Yes.
who questioned whether that was commercial sponsorship of that particular yacht. But as it happened, we allowed that yacht to race, and we've moved on from there.
Well, the club have been very blessed with their sponsors throughout the years, and the first major sponsor being Hitachi, and today, of course, Rolex. So
Yes.
the club are very lucky and very fortunate to have those wonderful sponsors.
Yes, but Peter, you and I, you much more than I, see yacht racing in other places, particularly in the Med, and I see Rolex supporting yacht racing throughout the Med. They do it very well. Their identification with the sport is excellent, and it's not just Sydney-Hobart Yacht Race. It's
No, of course, no.
international.
And during this time of serving on the board, and of course Commodore, you were still sailing quite actively on a number of boats.
Yes.
Tell us about a little boat called Ghost that you used to have with a couple of partners.
Well, that was a syndicate of myself and Warwick Hoare, who was an advertising agent, and Cole Graham, who was an architect, lives down in Bowral now. Cole had very thick spectacles. We used to call them beer bottles, the bottom of beer bottles. So Cole was a very good starting helmsman. We'd always have him start the race and just tell him to keep going. Everything was okay, don't worry, Cole. So we always got good starts.
I think everyone knew Cole couldn't see, so they kept out of his way. That's probably how you got good starts, wasn't it?
That's indeed,
Exactly.
That's the reason.
Yeah.
As soon as we got to the heads, he went off the helm.
Right. But then I think you got involved with Bill Ferris. You did a
Yes,
few regattas with Bill, one of which I remember in Hawaii in the
Yes.
Australian team in the Pan Am Clipper Cup. Was it still called that?
I think it was called that.
Yeah. 82, was it?
1984.
84, yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Raced in Hawaii with Bill on Indian Gibber.
Indian Gibber, that was
Gibber,
it. It
that's
was
right.
Indian Pacific
That's right.
renamed Indian Gibber
Gibber.
after the
Gib Fitting Company.
Fitting Company.
That Bill was
That's
involved
correct.
with. Yes,
That's
right.
correct.
Hawaii, enjoy Hawaii?
It's wonderful.
Yeah.
In the round the island race that is about the same length as a Sydney-Hobart yacht race, Marcus Blackmore and I sat on the rail for 300 miles. So we got to know each other very well.
Did you buy any shares in his company?
I did indeed.
Good. Yeah.
In fact, my son had $1,000 worth of shares in Blackmore's, and at the age, Angus, who has done 13 Sydney-Hobart yacht races, but my son had $1,000 worth of shares in the float of Blackmore's and was the youngest shareholder to go to the annual meetings.
There you go. Well done. So, and then I think, and you said 9 Sydney-Hobarts you've done, I think, is that?
12.
12.
12, yeah.
And you did a couple on Bewitched with Bill, the
Yes.
big 62-footer, the
Yes.
Herman Freres
I
design boat.
navigated that for Bill.
That's right.
Yes.
I remember we did a race together, which was a Montague Island race, the now defunct Montague Island race, which is always on the long weekend in October.
Yeah.
and you and I were together with Bill on Bewitched, and we had a light run down the harbour. We got round South Reef to head south, and the southerly started, and by the time we got to Jarvis Bay, it was snowing.
Yes.
Remember that?
Yes, I do.
No boats finished.
Yes.
And I think Bob Fraser, a Sydney sailmaker, who we know well, a member of the CYC, yourself and myself, 3 of the older members of the crew were up on the foredeck trying to get the storm jib off while the rest of the crew were violently seasick.
Yes.
You remember that?
I do.
Yeah. Sails were going everywhere, no boats finished. It was incredible. And after that was the demise of the Montague race. I think they only held it a couple of times after that.
Yeah, I think that was the end of it.
Yes.
I'm not sure whether we pulled into Bermagui, and it was the best T-bone steak I've ever had in my life at the Bermagui RSL.
And what are memories, Kerry, of Hobart races? I mean, any one race stick out for you? Or?
I think the one on Bewitched where we came in 5th that year on line honours, and it's a funny thing, but I went to school with Roger Henry, whose father ran the Australian newsprint mill up in New Norfolk in Hobart. And after he retired, his wife, they lived near Sandy Bay. And I can remember Mrs. Henry ringing the bell on their front lawn as Bewitched sailed past on its way to the finish line. So
very nice.
It was a lovely
touch
that there was Mrs. Henry welcoming us to Hobart.
Yes. And of course your family were much involved in sailing. Your sons have sailed well, and your grandchildren as well. Yeah, it's nice.
Angus, as I said, has done 13 Sydney-Hobart races. Won one on 2KY on handicap. And Ben, my 19-year-old grandson, we have high hopes that he'll be 3rd generation.
Wonderful.
Sydney-Hobart sailor.
If I could go step forward a few years to 1997, I think you headed up a strategic plan, well, the club asked you to look at the upgrade of the clubhouse and the marina and the development in general of the club, and that was a pretty big project you undertook.
It was, yes.
Yeah.
I rejoined the board with David Fuller, who was Commodore at the time, and the club had perhaps lost its way a little bit. So I did head the committee that enunciated the strategic plan for the club for the next 5 years. And it's interesting that now the club is talking about doing that again, that we need to have a clear understanding of the direction of the club, and life changes, as we know. So there are questions about what sort of boats should be allowed to sail to Hobart, and will we shortly see foiling, monohulls? So it's quite possible that in the next 2 or 3 years we'll see a foiling boat entered, and how do we handle that as a club and a committee? And it's interesting to see the innovation that's coming into sailing, as it is in everything else we do in life.
And I know last year I had some dialogue and meetings with you. You were a driving force to try and get an Australian challenge for the next America's Cup, which will be held in New Zealand.
Yeah.
And of course we thought that being in New Zealand it was logistically a lot easier than going to Europe or to America. But I know you worked very hard on that to try and get funds raised, but unfortunately it didn't eventuate, did it?
No, it didn't. Part of the issue was the cost that escalated when the New Zealanders announced the design characteristics for the challenge for the event. So a 70-foot foiling monohull became very expensive, and we were looking at least $150 million to mount a challenge, and it was very hard to find a cornerstone sponsor for that sort of money. So we gave it a good go, as you know, Peter, but regrettably Australia is not represented this year, this time.
And, you know, as I said, you're a 48-year member, coming up in a couple of years' time for a 50-year membership, but you're still very actively involved in the club. You take a great interest, and I think you're on a couple of subcommittees, a premises committee that looks
Yes,
over
indeed.
the whole area of the club. So that still gives you a lot of close involvement with the club. And as past Commodore, you meet with current Commodore and discuss the club at various times.
Yeah, we do.
Which is great.
Yeah, the past Commodores do gather a few times a year. We try not to be intrusive into the administration of the club. Although sitting on the Site and Marina Committee, I think that's a contribution that I can make to the club. We've just completed the renovations and we're very pleased with the way that's turned out. We have further work to do with the car park, and we'd like to see the club upgraded over the next few years.
So just as we wrap up, how do you see the club placed now, sort of financially and from a sailing point of view? And do you I think we're in pretty good shape. Do you think we are? I
think the club is. Having been educated and working for a time in Melbourne, I marvel at the support that Melbourne has provided to the sporting community. So they have now the Australian Open Tennis is a venue that is the best in the world for the Grand Slams. I hear the last event last month, the players have said it's by far the best slam in the world. But Melbourne has that wonderful precinct of the MCG, the Australian Open Tennis. So they have the grand final there, which we know. They have the Melbourne Cup, they have the Grand Prix, and they have the Boxing Day Test. All very strongly supported by government. In New South Wales, regrettably, we haven't supported our sporting activities here anywhere near to the extent that they've done in Victoria. And Peter, you know that I often say we have only one iconic sporting event in Sydney. It's the Sydney-Hobart yacht race. We need to do more. We need support for all of our sports in Sydney and facilities and in New South Wales. And it's something that that I would like to make a contribution to see New South Wales lift its game in what I regard as the most important thing in life, and that's staying well. And sport is the way we stay well.
Will you be standing for pre-selection for the coming state election to push that bar up?
I'm not that silly.
But just very quickly, Richard Roxburgh, the well-known Australian actor, he's a cousin of yours, is that right?
Yes, he's my first cousin.
Right,
yes,
there you go.
Yes.
He's done very well.
He's done very well. He's 20 years younger than me. He's the youngest of my Uncle Jack's family, but the family is close, and we're very proud of what Richard's achieved as an actor and as an individual. So.
Yes, he's done very well.
Yeah.
Well, Kerry, thank you, and thank you on behalf of the club, I think, for your contribution over many, many years, and it's great to see you still involved with the club and still taking a very keen interest. So thanks for your time and continue in good health.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks for seeing me today.